Welcome to the Audio Renaissance Tapes presentation of The Making of a Country Lawyer. Written by Gerry Spence. Adapted for audio and produced by Tony Hutz. And now, here is Gerry Spence.
She was a woman you'd look at, all right. A woman you wouldn't mind people seeing you with, but up close you knew something was awry. Her dark hair, burnt umber, was graying slightly. You suspected that she had the face messed with by some plastic surgeon. You know how they look, those kinds of faces, smooth, especially under the eyes not left with any tracks of life. Each side of the nose pulled down tight, the skin translucent like rawhide on a drum. Back up a little, say 3 feet, and it was all right. The woman's eyes were ordinary blue and tired, but it was hard to see much more there. Still in the dream, I could tell she was my mother, and she'd come home. I had recognized her before she saw me. I'd called out to her, and I'd grabbed both of her hands and pulled her to me. "Mother," I cried. She shied back to focus on me. Then she pulled a hand free, and she covered part of her face as if in horror. I was so old. I was an old man. The last time she'd seen me, I'd been a boy of 20, blond and thin and tall. She looked younger than I remembered her. The last time I'd seen her, she'd been sitting silently across from me in that small forest green living room. My mother, distant, cool. "Mother, you've come home," I was crying, an old man crying. "You've come home." She stared at me. "I'm your son. I'm Gerry. Don't you remember me?" She stared as if in disbelief. "I'm old now, Mother. On the outside old, but on the inside, I'm still your boy. Your boy, Mother. Aren't you glad to see me?" "Oh, yes, of course," she said politely. "But you look so young," I said. "How can that be?" "I'm not young," she said. And then the music began, and we walked over to where the people were dancing, and I said, "Would you care to dance?" And she didn't reply, just stood there. I took her in my arms, and I told her how glad I was that she'd come home. And she said nothing in response. And we danced. And at that moment, before I awakened from my dream, I was very happy. It was a cold night in hell, the night that kid was born, my father liked to say. 20 below and blowin'. The wind always blew in Laramie. I was the firstborn to Gerald and Esther Spence, born at home with the help of a midwife shortly after midnight on January 8, 1929, in Laramie, Wyoming. My father was a country boy, a hillbilly kid, as he liked to call himself. He walked with his hands in his pockets, a tow-headed, chubby-faced little kid between him and that farm girl in her homemade dress, askew. In 1938, the country lay still deep in the Depression, and the insurance salesmen came to our house like leopards in the night. The leopards filled my folks with fear about the terrible things that could befall a man and how his family could be put on the street if he died without insurance. And then there were the bums who kept coming to our door, dirty, blank-eyed, homeless men. Could she spare a hungry man a meal? She always fed them, but only on the back porch. I watched them eat silently in large gulps, and they wouldn't look up from their eating. And when they finished, they thanked my mother with a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," and left. Probably the children of a father who died without insurance, I thought. And my mother would ask, how would it be if she and little Gerry had to go house to house asking for food and a place to sleep? She probably'd have to go back to her father's farm in Colorado. And remember, she already had a bad back from that back-breaking work on the farm when she was a girl. That's why she had to wear her Spencer corset, a frightful piece of armor made of canvas and stays that came up over her rib cage and laced down the front, and in the back it extended down around her buttocks. Said she couldn't work without it. Her back pained her so. They had saved 6 months to buy it. And of course, all of us were afraid because little Peggy had died. She'd gotten sick that summer morning, and by night she was dead, cerebral meningitis. My first memories were of this small angel, she barely 3 and I 4, her eyes luminous, her happiness an inexhaustible flame. She'd been my first friend. I, the big 4-year-old brother, took her with me everywhere I went. I remember her small, chubby hand and how it felt. And then she died. I can see the small, closed casket, the wreath of pink roses on top. They said she was sleeping inside and that she would be with God. Then they shipped her body to Colorado. So it became very clear to me at an early age that God was not trustworthy. God could take you any time, and if God could take little Peggy, he could take our father, just like that. I heard the preachers every Sunday. If you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you will know the unspeakable bliss of eternal salvation. If you don't, hell awaits. The insurance salesman argued the same. Buy our insurance, and you'll enjoy security. Fail to buy it, and it's easy to sell salvation and insurance. Were it otherwise, the insurance industry and the churches wouldn't control the major wealth of the world. Years later, as a lawyer, I viewed the insurance companies with their pay-on-death policies and carnival crooks and their shell games and mafia chiefs with their protection scams as all kindred under the skin. They all peddled the same thing, the placation of fear. All understood the dominant motivations of the species, fear and greed. In the end, fear wins out. My gentle father never ran from a soul. He never hid. He never locked a door. My father wasn't even afraid of dying. But he was afraid of leaving his wife and his child penniless. Love fueled his fear, and he bought $10,000 worth of life insurance, more than he could afford. A fortune in those days. Every month my father cashed his paycheck and brought the cash home. Then he and my mother counted it out on the kitchen table. The church's share came off the top. Looked to me as if they were playing both ends against the middle. If God took my father, we had the insurance. If he didn't, we had my father, and the insurance company had our money. Seemed like God and the insurance companies were in cahoots. Anybody could see that. My mother was a tall, handsome woman. My grandfather Flieger had not been able to keep her down, neither down in spirit nor down on the farm. Education wasn't for women, Grandpa Flieger argued. Women were already too smart. But when she finished grade school, this renegade daughter left the farm to attend prep school, as they called high school in the early 1920s. She worked her way, cooking and waiting tables and washing dishes at a boarding house where she met my father. She attended college at Colorado A&M, where she took a Bachelor of Science degree. After she graduated, she traipsed off to the Navajo country for a job at a boarding school near Durango, Colorado, teaching home economics. My mother made most of my and my father's clothing on her Montgomery Ward electric sewing machine. She made our shirts and our pajamas, and she sewed our coats out of the deer and elk hide skinned from the game my father had killed. My mother's sewing stitches were never straight. Straight stitches were not the issue. A seam that would hold was. I watched her lay out the hides and cut out the patterns from old newspapers. I can see her bent over the old sewing machine, urging it on, attacking the leather, punching it, pulling and jerking on it, and attacking it again until at last she formed it into coats for me and my father. And despite the crooked stitches, there was something wonderful about wearing something close to one's heart that had been fashioned by the caring hands of one's mother. Outside, my mother worked in our backyard garden. My father spaded it by hand. I helped. We planted radishes and carrots and beets and lettuce and spinach and squash and beans and peas. It was as if we were in charge of the universe. And in the far corner of the yard, a large chokecherry tree flourished. Every spring, Mother planted flowers, snapdragons and phlox and sweet peas and petunias. My father worked in his garden until he was past 90. I think of all of the very old and beautiful men I have known, and most have been gardeners. To understand very much of anything at all, one must believe in magic, and there is magic in a garden. The magic of growth, the same magic that nourishes the plants, that fills the gardener's nostrils with their pungent smells and his lungs with their earthy power, and his hands with the clean feel of dirt. As they are inextricably attached to the act of living, gardeners, I have found, live approximately forever. My mother was content at home. The suffragette movement had not touched her life. Her role was as important as that of my father, who showed her great respect. I thought they loved each other a good deal. Only once did I hear them argue, something to do with Peggy's death. I asked if this meant they were going to get a divorce. No, my father said, we're not going to get a divorce. Then he put his arms around my mother and held her to his chest, and she sobbed for a very long time. When my father saw me staring at them, my face frozen in horror, he said, "You'd better go outside and play. It'll be all right." But I didn't believe it would be all right, although my mother often proclaimed that sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never harm you. I learned early on that words could kill. Words left wounds, and if the wounds ever healed, scars were left in their place. Still, in the days that followed, my mother seemed happy enough. She laughed often, laughing by sucking in air, which sounded as much like sobbing as laughter. A laugh that had never been given permission to come bursting forth to release the sound of unrestrained human joy. Fall was the season of beginnings, a new hunting season, a new grade in school, and chokecherries. Chokecherries, I thought, must be God's favorite tree. For not only did the berries make the best jelly in the universe, but the trees always grew best next to a good trout stream. One clear, early fall Sunday, we drove the Model A north of town to a dilapidated old farm to buy a milking goat my father paid $10 for. It was my job to take care of Nanny. My father's job was to milk her, and Mother's to strain and refrigerate the milk and skim off the rich white cream. Goat's milk was said to be healthy, especially for children. Nanny was a smart, sweet goat, and soon she was following me like a pup. I pastured Nanny on the creek bank. Then I would tie her to a stake on a long cotton rope and go about my business playing Hop-Along Cassidy. When Nanny came fresh, she had twins, little brown kids with a white streak down their faces. They chased each other in circles and climbed on everything and chewed on everything. I fed them out of a bottle so we could milk Nanny. Then one day, one of the kids was gone, and for supper we had the best and sweetest meat I'd ever eaten. "What's this meat?" I asked. No one answered. I got up from the table and looked out the kitchen window into the backyard. "Where is Jupiter?" I asked, referring to the missing kid. "We couldn't keep Jupiter," my father said. "Are we eating Jupiter?" I asked. After a long moment, my father said in his quiet voice, "Yep, we're eating Jupiter." My mother said, "Remember, son, God put goats on the earth for man's health and for his sustenance. We mustn't forget that." On that day, at that moment, there at that kitchen table, I began the irreversible slide out of innocence. How could you eat your friends and be a Christian? In Wyoming, fall can have a heart attack and die in one day. The heavy snows came often before we had our flannels on. In the winter, which could come as early as October, we went sledding on Tank Hill, where the town's water tank rose up like a great windowless castle. In Wyoming, spring fought birth like a child who dreads its fate. Yet finally it came bursting, in song and smell, and the fuzzy touch of buds, and the primal deep hug of life. We raised chickens in springtime in our backyard in Sheridan. We bought the baby chicks for 6 cents each, little yellow, fuzzy, peeping balls. We brought them home in a cardboard box, and at night we hung a light bulb over the box and covered the box to keep the baby chicks warm. We fed them ground corn, and we put water for them in an empty tuna fish can, and the chicks grew nearly overnight. Soon they graduated to the chicken house, and soon after that they grew into fryer size. A couple became our Sunday dinners, chicken and dumplings and chicken with noodles. The rest went into mason jars for winter. The eggs we didn't eat we stored for winter's use in a 10-gallon crock filled with water glass, a soupy silicone jelly that sealed the pores of the eggs so they were slow to rot. In the summer, the family rented the 2 spare bedrooms as well as my room to the tourists, 50 cents a night. For a long time I remained mortified by the fact that our family had to take in lodgers. My room rented last because it was upstairs, and the renter had to climb up and down the stairs to get to the bathroom. In the summertime, I slept on an army cot in the backyard in our old hunting tent, which my father pitched under the chokecherry tree. After breakfast, my mother and I would wash the tourist sheets of the night before, and I would hang them out in the backyard to dry. And when they were dry, I brought them in by the armfuls, the smell of the cottons fresh and clean. The next day, I ironed the sheets on the kitchen ironing board, and after the tourists had gone, I made up the beds with clean-pressed linens. To the horror of my mother, some of the tourists smoked in the rooms. She would open the windows and complain strongly about such people, who fouled not only God's temple but our home as well. When I had earned several dollars from the rental of my room, I rode my bike to the First National Bank of Sheridan, the money and my little green savings deposit book tucked safely in my overalls. I put my money away in what was known as my college fund. The promise was that if I studied hard and behaved myself, I'd grow up and go off to college, and with God's help, I might thereafter make something of myself. Late summer was canning time. I can hear the spitting sound of the old pressure cooker, the escaping steam filling the room with the smell of cooking. By fall, one side of the basement was lined with shelves brimming with jars of fruits and vegetables. In the late summer, when the canning specials were on at Piggly Wiggly, my mother bought peaches and apricots by the bushel, plums and cherries by the box, and sugar by the 100-pound sack, and hauled them all home and canned them all. She canned the beets and beans and peas and tomatoes and corn from the garden. Then it was fall, hunting season again, and she canned elk and deer and antelope. I thought my mother was the canningest woman who ever lived. I thought she would have canned salvation in pickle juice and holiness in salt brine if she'd had half a chance. I thought my mother's bargain with life was a pretty good one. She made as much money for the family by her work at home as she could have made had she worked at the dime store for 10 cents an hour, and she got to stay at home and raise her family. Besides, we didn't need to be a family with 2 working parents. In those days, we didn't have to buy automatic washing machines and dryers, and we didn't have to own a dishwasher and 2 cars and a couple of television sets. In those days, we didn't have deep freezes and TV dinners. We never heard of pizza, and today's franchise restaurants hadn't yet been invented. My mother owned 2 Sunday dresses, one black and one red, and her clothes and my father's, one navy blue Sunday suit, all fit into one small closet. My father wore a white shirt and the same blue tie he'd had for Lord knows how many years. Such were all the clothes anyone needed, the excess of which would have been sin and vanity. I owned 1 pair of Sunday shoes and 1 pair of school boots, the lace-up kind with the knife pocket on the side. I wore to school my 1 pair of knickers with their deer-hide patches at the knees, and I had 1 itchy wool Sunday suit and a Sunday hat. I thought my mother was more free than many mothers today. She never had to give up her role as mother to a daycare center or to babysitters. She never had to surrender to the demands of the good life, because to her she had a good life, a loving husband, and a son whom she had secretly given to God. She was her own boss, and the boss of the house as well, and she was good at it. She paid the bills, and what little credit we had was good. We owed no money to the banks. In those days, in the twilight of the Great Depression, my parents were solvent. They were employed, and they had a little put away for a rainy day. But in the end, the value of my mother's labor didn't inure to the benefit of the family. Any excess over and above the bare necessities my father provided out of his paycheck also did not accrue to the family's betterment. My father and mother invested the best part of my father's savings and my mother's home labor in that very dear insurance policy, and years later, when he needed it, it proved inadequate to pay a week's stay in the hospital, much less enough to take care of his widow for even part of a year. Over the years, I evened the score against that industry, not once, but hundreds of times. When a case against an insurance company came up for settlement, I, representing the widows or orphans or the horribly maimed, would set a just goal in dollars. Then at the last minute, my settlement offer would go up. Not much, maybe only $10,000. like the $10,000 policy my parents labored most of their lifetimes to pay for, one bitter dollar at a time. My annual visit to my grandparents in Colorado was like a trek to a foreign land. It was my mother's job to take me. My father stayed home, using his precious vacation time to hunt. My father had been working as a chemist for the CB&Q Railroad in Galesburg when little Peggy died. And when my parents fled Illinois the day following Peggy's funeral, as if fleeing the plague, I traveled with them to Lompoc, California, where my father found work as a laborer at the Sea Light Products Company. All day he pushed a hand truck carrying 4 80-pound sacks of Sea Light, from the packers to the stackers in the warehouse. At night he ached so badly he could scarcely undress. My father had always been a working man, spawned from the most humble beginnings, and he never forgot where he came from. Although he was a chemist by education, at heart his allegiance was with the men who labored in the plants and the mills and the mines. He was a Democrat and a Union man. He loved Franklin D. Roosevelt and disdained Hoover. He respected those who earned an honest living by hard work, was unafraid of work himself, and would not tolerate the mistreatment of any person. He believed that those who exercised power over others were suspect, for most often power in the hands of the powerful is exercised wrongfully. His true friends were the working men. He understood them. They talked his language. He trusted them and respected them and fought for them, and was proud that the workers were his friends. After 3 or 4 months, I traveled with my parents back to Wyoming, where my father took the chemist's job at the tie-treating plant at Sheridan, again for the CB&Q. Traveling on the train with my mother to my grandparents was a powerful primary experience for me, and the magic that took us there from Sheridan each summer was the free railroad pass, one of the few comps provided by the railroad for the families of its employees. The free pass, of course, was not good for anything but the chair car. Rich people rode in the Pullman. In some of the chair cars, the men's bathroom, which was at one end of the car, was inside the smoking room, and if you had to go, you had to brave it through the smoke. "You hold your breath, Jerry, when you walk through that room," my mother admonished, "and don't talk to the men in there. If men will desecrate their bodies, which are the Lord's temples, with tobacco smoke, and if they'll become addicted to such a horrid habit, and do so voluntarily, and against God's will, they're not the kind of men a boy should know or talk to." She'd warned me before about such noxious places. When in the summer I walked in downtown Sheridan and had to pass the Main Street bars, their doors flung open against the heat, she would warn me in the same fashion. "When you walk by those bars, Jerry, you hold your breath. You shouldn't let the smell of alcohol enter your body. You wouldn't let such smells into church, and you shouldn't let such smells into your body." After 9 o'clock, the conductor turned off the lights. I remember the sound of the steel wheels on the rails, the hypnotic clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. On into the night, the sound of the train's long whistle far ahead, the insistent ding-ding-ding of crossing bells, the old chair car at full speed swaying back and forth like a boat over heavy waves. I hear and feel those sounds and motions today, and should I ever be awarded a ticket to heaven, I hope it would be on a train speeding through the night, and I would listen to that clickety-clack and sway into the edge of eternal sleep on the old CB&Q. We changed trains at Alliance, Nebraska, and again at Denver. Our luggage was one huge, cheap black metal suitcase and another black leather bag about the size of a 100-pound bag of flour. I would grapple with the latter, while my mother lifted the metal suitcase, staggered and struggled with it a few feet at a time, sat it down, caught her breath, and started all over again. Denver was the largest city in the world so far as I knew. It even had a Woolworth store with an escalator. We had a long layover in Denver, about 5 or 6 hours. We checked the big metal suitcase in at the depot check stand, 10 cents, but we carried the handbag to save the extra dime. At Woolworth's, I walked along the open counters. I gawked at the bags of beautiful glass marbles, and I stared at the cheap, black-painted tin revolver that clicked inside. Click, 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 you're dead when you pull the trigger. I saved my allowance, 10 cents a week, as long as I did the dishes once a day. I bought a bag of marbles for a dime and the clicker gun and the holster for 30 cents. Then suddenly it was time to go. The fairy tale was ending, the magic trance in its last afterglow. And then my mother said those words that will ring in my ears until I die. Whatever will we do if we miss the train? It was the most dreadful of all possibilities. Her face was grim, her eyes consumed with fear. We ran as fast as we could. Whatever will we do? We would probably die in the streets, I thought. We would be captured by the gypsies and become their slaves. To this day, my mother's transferred fear plunges me into the most unrelenting anxiety whenever I am about to catch a plane. Whatever will I do if I miss the plane? As the years pass, we take on the outward appearances of adults, but it is only a large, noisy, hairy-chested facade that obscures the child within. Like the tree, we have grown from the inside out. When the train pulled into that desolate place called Lyman, Colorado, Grandpa and Grandma Flieger were there to meet us. The town looked as if the people had long ago abandoned it. Newspapers blew up against the sides of the buildings, and empty cans rolled in the wind down Main Street. The wind in Lyman, Colorado never stopped, and the dryland farmers, deep into the Depression, struggled to survive in those desperate Dust Bowl days of the grapes of wrath. Grandpa flung our bags into the trunk of his old black Buick, then drove the wreck back to the farm. Oncoming cars got out of his way. All creatures, man or beast, got out of his way. He was not in awe of preachers. He had no insurance. He had no respect for bankers, and he wasn't afraid of the Depression. He wasn't even afraid of God. He gave 10 cents, no more, to the church on Sunday morning. If that wasn't enough, well, God could go to hell. The Fliegers were strong, square-made people. Grandpa with that broad, powerful chest and strong arms, and a large square head and dark hair, and Grandmother short with hardly any figure at all, scurrying around the kitchen like a busy, frightened country mouse. She wore a plain cotton dress that tied in the back, and she smiled at me with soft, dark eyes that seemed happy when Grandpa wasn't around. Her once black hair was graying and done up neatly in a bun. She was a gentle-spoken woman with a heavy German accent who never raised her voice and who never, not once, spoke back to my grandfather. Leonard and Barbara Flieger had settled in Minnesota before the turn of the century. There in the year 1901, my mother was born, their second child. In about 1907, Leonard Flieger caught the go-west itch. He was going to homestead in Colorado, going to be a big-time farmer, going to own half the county by the time he was ready to retire. He settled in Lyman. On Grandpa's farm, he and his 3 sons had built a large red barn with a few small outbuildings and a sternly upright 2-story white house. Next to the barn, a windmill rattled and banged, complaining against the constant prairie gale. The grass, the little that had not been worn away, was short, brown, dust-covered, and hard. The cottonwood trees that once shaded the farm had long since died, their bark blown off by the wind. One could see nothing but dirt and blowing dust for as far as the eye could focus. I thought of my grandfather Flieger's as a place of death. Nothing wanted to grow there, and all living things soon gave up their lives. The head of the vealed calf, dropped behind the barn where it had been slaughtered, lay, gazing up at the sun, its tongue rotted out, the flies pecking away at its eyes. Even the prairies died and lay down to be covered by the blowing dust. My parents were married in the summer of 1927 at that same Flieger farm. A big affair on the prairies, this dryland farmer's oldest daughter getting married. Grandpa Flieger didn't think Gerald Milner Spence was worthy of his daughter. No man really was, especially this man, who was not a landed man, not a businessman, not a German. My mother wore a white satin dress, one that she and her mother had made. She carried a bouquet of long-stemmed white roses that had been shipped in all the way from Denver. My father, his hair trimmed short and his ears sticking out, wore his navy blue suit. After they were married, they moved to Laramie, Wyoming, where my father took up his duties as assistant state chemist and where I was later born. I was always afraid of Grandpa Flieger. Everybody around him was. He spoke in a loud voice to people, as if they were a couple of blocks away instead of standing next to him, and sometimes he didn't laugh when things were really funny. He had that German sense of humor, or lack of it, my father said. He also thought himself a poet. He made a poem up about me. Gerald Leonard Spence sitting on a fence, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. When our visit was over at Grandpa Flieger's, my mother and I boarded the train once more and traveled to Loveland, Colorado, where Grandpa and Grandma Spence came to meet us. Grandfather Spence looked for all the world as I imagined Santa Claus would look if he shaved off his beard. We'd walk down to the barn, Grandpa and me holding his rough old hand, his other hand swinging a shiny, empty milk pail. His steps were short and his legs crooked, and he limped. After milking, we headed for the house with the full pail and poured it into the milk separator in the cellar. Grandpa turned the handle faster and faster, and in moments the milk began to pour from the separator spout into a clean pail. The cream, in a smaller stream, poured from another spout into a kettle. The skim milk was left to sour on the back porch, and when it was ripe, it was fed to the chickens. The cream went to Grandma for sweet butter, and some was set aside for Grandpa's cereal. Not a drop of milk was ever wasted. Many years later, when I had grown into an older man, I began to see my life as Grandpa's bucket of milk, and I began to think how precious the milk. In the morning, after Grandpa finished his chores, he harnessed his mules in the barn, drove them out, and depending on the work of the day, hitched them to a mower or a rake or a V-shaped scoop called a ditcher. Mother Nature doesn't like ditches, he said. See how she grows them over? But if we can't keep water in the ditch, we can't water the orchard. And if we can't water the orchard, we won't have any apples. And if we don't have any apples, Grandma can't make any apple pie. And if Grandma can't make apple pie, then we'll be unhappy men, won't we? So we better go clean the ditch. Sometimes he would hand me the reins, and there I'd be in control of those powerful beasts, a boy who didn't come up much past the mules' underbellies. Grandma Spence reminded me of a skinny, nervous sparrow. She weighed less than 90 pounds. She wore her waist-long brown hair done up in a bun behind her head, a very businesslike little lady, without much humor, who walked on her thin legs as fast as a mouse skitters. I remember sitting in the dining room one hot afternoon. Grandma was there working on some embroidery. Quietly she said, "Jerry, your mother is a wonderful Christian woman. She's an example for all of us to follow. I wish I could be as good a Christian as she." I didn't say anything. I knew she was pretty perfect, all right. I knew she was like Christ, like Mrs. Christ anyway. I knew she prayed and had taught me to pray, and that she believed in God, but I never knew she was so good that my little Grandma Spence, who was so pious she never even laughed, wanted to be like my mother. It made me proud. When I was 10, my sister Barbara Jean was born, thus ending my life as an only child, this new little angel, Barbara. How I loved her, this small doll with curly brown hair and large blue eyes and a tiny nose. I became adept at changing diapers. I hung out the wash for my mother, brought the clothes in from the line, folded the diapers, kept the diaper pail clean. The immense joy of this child was not only her beauty, but her radiating happiness, which touched us all. 2 years later, Thomas John Spence was born. I named him myself. His name had to be Tom because then it would be Tom and Jerry, after the cartoon cat and mouse characters. My mother had often insisted that I had important things to do. Yet I wondered how my mother could possibly know that I was going to amount to something. I knew that I had a very high IQ, somewhere close to near genius, they said. But if I was so smart, why did I have to work as hard in school as the others? I acted smart, all right, but I didn't feel smart. And I wasn't tough. And I scared easy. Now I knew a boy had to work. Boys who do not work are lazy, and it's sinful to be lazy. It's bad to play without first earning the right to play by working. But another thing I knew was business was better than labor. Selling. My mother told me that the world turns on selling. Her brothers had left the farm and became salesmen. Finally ended up with their own car agencies, and my mother said they were rich. She claimed you could sell God's word just as easy as you could sell a car. Preaching is mostly selling, she said once. Salesmanship is mostly asking. Thus I began to consider a career as a salesman. Indeed, I eventually became one, for successful trial lawyering is merely the sale of the truth and justice of one's case to the jury. But what did I have to sell in Sheridan, Wyoming? I walked around the yard looking for something to sell. Then suddenly I saw them. The flowers, of course. "How do you sell flowers?" I asked Mother. "Here's the phone book," my mother replied. "You can call all the cafes and the hotels in town and ask them if they'd like to buy your flowers." I sat down at the phone and began to call. "Would you like to buy some sweet peas, 2 bunches for $1?" Most said no. The others just hung up. "That isn't the way to do it," my mother said. "You say, 'I have some very pretty, very fresh, very sweet-smelling sweet peas here, and I only charge $1 for 2 bunches. Can I deliver some to you?' You have to paint them a picture. They have to actually see the sweet peas and smell them. Then they'll buy them." I sold my first sweet peas to the Sheridan Inn, where Buffalo Bill used to stay. Later in the summer I sold zinnias and snapdragons and phlox, and my mother showed me how to make the bouquets beautiful with asparagus fern. Then, after the phone sales had been made, I would trudge down the street with the bouquets wrapped in newspaper, and where the stems gathered I soaked the paper in water to keep the bouquets fresh. Once I sold some sweet peas to the Rex Rooms, a walk-up hotel on Main Street. I climbed a long, narrow flight of wooden stairs to a door with a peephole. I rang the bell. After a while, a woman wearing a black silk bathrobe answered the door. She wore high-heeled slippers, and she looked bad, but for reasons I wasn't sure of, I thought she looked good. "I'm here with the flowers, ma'am." "Come on in, kid," she said. She smelled good, too, better than lilacs, better than roses, even almost as good as my sweet peas. We were joined by a big blonde woman. She took the sweet peas I was clutching and gave me the $1. "Cute little fella, isn't he?" the black-haired woman said, giving me a very wet kiss on the back of my neck. My face got all flushed and hot, and I couldn't think of what to say. "Too bad they grow up," the blonde woman said. On the way home from the Rex Room, that walk-up hotel that was, of course, really a walk-up bordello, I passed the bars on Main Street, smelling the pungent, musky smell of stale beer wafting onto the sidewalk. Dutifully, I held my breath. J.S. Taylor School was a square, old, tan, 2-story brick building. The school's goal was etched over the front door. Enter here to learn, go out to serve. The schoolhouse had 6 grades, the first 3 grades on the ground floor, the 4th, 5th, and 6th on the top floor. I first heard the Nutcrackers Suite in Miss Bagnell's first-grade class, where we read about Dick and Jane and Spot. I then skipped the 2nd grade, a horrible mistake, for when in later years the rest of the boys could point with pride to newly sprouting pubic hair, I had nothing to show. When the boys in my class were developing deep voices, I was still singing soprano. When the boys went out for sports, I couldn't compete. I was good at spelling, I was also good at drawing, and I could write stories. I learned the multiplication tables from cards we took home, and after I'd studied and my mother tested me, my father would reward me. I'd crawl up on his lap, and then he'd pull out the Sheridan Press and turn directly to the funnies. He read me Dick Tracy and Orphan Annie, Blondie and Dagwood, Major Hoople, and Alley-Oop. Alley-Oop was my favorite, this caveman who rode on a dinosaur called Dinny. Oh, what a fortune I would give to return to childhood for just one evening, to curl up on my father's lap, to experience once more the pure joy I knew when my father read the funnies. Each year my parents invited my teacher to our house for supper, and we put on our Sunday's best, and we suffered through a very polite and formal evening. We sat there in the living room, my teacher and my father and I didn't know what to say. My father wasn't much of a conversationalist either. There were long pauses and a lot of throat clearing and smiling and looking at the hands. The dinner talk was polite, mostly about the food and how my father had hunted the elk we were eating. Then at 8 o'clock, my parents sent me off to bed. Once out of their presence, they got the full report on me. I eavesdropped, of course. Frankly, he's a little show-off, I heard the teacher say. I know, my mother replied sadly. He wants all the attention on himself. Yes, my mother said quietly. He's very bright. He's ahead of all the other children, even though he skipped a grade. And I don't know what to do with him. He slumps down in his seat all the time, and his shoulders are getting round. We're a round-shouldered lot, my father said in his offhand way. I recommend that you take his suspenders off. I think they're pulling his shoulders down, the teacher said. The next day, my mother took the suspenders off my breeches and took me aside. You shouldn't be a smarty, Jerry. No one likes a smarty. I tried not to be a smart aleck, but it was impossible. I was addicted to speech. Besides, how could one remain quiet when there was so much to say? When I was 12, I shot my first deer. I shot it as a trespasser on the private property of one of the rich English ranchers, an English remittance man, one of those ne'er-do-wells from a titled British family who was shipped to far-off America where he could no longer embarrass his noble parents. In return, he received a yearly remittance from England, by which his alleged noble blood was nourished while he chiefly sat on his noble Pratt in deepest Wyoming. These early remittance men had bought up the choicest land in Sheridan County. They built ranches and stocked them with fancy horses. They had taken the beautiful stream bottoms at the foot of the Bighorns and erected their mansions there. The rustic locals were kept away by fences and signs. No hunting, fishing, or trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Only their own noble class was welcome. I once asked my grandfather Spence about our own ancestry. Do we have any blue blood in us, Grandpa? No, my boy, my grandfather replied. The Spences have only got good red blood in their veins. Spence means pantry. Comes from the word dispenser. We were the king's pantry keepers. The only thing we've ever inherited from the king was a good appetite. He laughed his soft, merry laugh, and then he added, But I'll say one thing about the Spences. There hasn't been a felon or a drunk among the lot of us. Shooting a deer on the private lands of the king's nobleman was like playing Robin Hood, I thought. Like Robin Hood, we had a score to settle with the king's nobleman, and my father was bent on settling it. Our favorite fishing spot was Little Goose Canyon, where a clear mountain stream filled with small rainbow and a few browns came roaring out of the Bighorns. When I was a small child, we often picnicked on Sundays in Little Goose Canyon. But one Sunday, when we arrived at the mouth of the canyon, we were confronted with a new barbed wire fence that had been stretched across the road by the said king's nobleman. Others had turned back, but not my father. Why, that son of a buck, my father exclaimed. Does he think he owns the world? This is a county road. What are you going to do, Daddy? My father didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, Get out of the car. We got out of the car and watched, half in awe, half in fear, as my father backed up the old Ford about 100 feet and revved up the motor. Then he let out the clutch. I can see the old car bouncing down the road at its top speed in second gear. I can hear the high, sweet sound of its motor, see the dust flying. My father bent over the steering wheel, his jaw set, his eyes ablaze. He hit the center fence post and down it went. And then the wires snapped one at a time and went flying in every direction. He brought the car to a stop. Get in, my father hollered. What are we going to do now, Daddy? I asked. We're going fishing, he said. My father's sense of justice and the code of ethics by which he was guided were not always in sync with the law. That certain acts were lawful and unlawful did not necessarily make them right or wrong. Right was right and wrong was wrong, and my father didn't need lawyers or lawmakers to advise him which was which. Often I have used the Robin Hood metaphor to describe to a jury my intentions in a trial. To the same extent that the deer on the land of the king's nobleman at Sheridan belonged not to him but to the state, and hence to all of us, so too justice is not a commodity that should be available only to the rich, who are born with the power of wealth and position, and are therefore permitted to fence in justice to the exclusion of all others. The safeguards of the Constitution are legal fences intended to preserve justice for all. Many years later, and after much self-examination and much sport-killing in the courtroom, I would come to a simple realization. Killing in the courtroom is like killing in the mountains, and like all killing, carries with it the same ethical standards I saw my father live by when I was a child. One does not kill in the courtroom for the sheer sport of killing. One does not kill the opponent simply because one can. Only mad dogs, a few rogue wolves, and trophy hunters with piddling self-esteem kill for pleasure. The process known as the trial must not be a mere exercise in killing. Instead, it should better be the means by which justice is nourished and by which the rights of ordinary people are fed. When I walk into a courtroom, I am the hunter. When I step into the arena, I feel as if I step into eons of history, of bloody duels, of misery and killing and fear. The king's champion has always been pitted against the poor. The trial by duel, the adversary system we call it. It is a fair fight, is it not? The king has a champion as does the poor man. Indeed, there could be no duel in the courtroom, no killing of the poor, unless the poor were defended. So we understand at last that providing the poor with a champion to fight for him may be more to ensure that the duel can occur in the first place than to provide the poor a chance at justice. And the judge who enforces the rules of the fight, is he not always the king's man? It is then in the courtroom that I hunt and I kill. And for the killing to be right, it must be done cleanly, without unnecessary wounding, done with respect, done without waste, done without pleasure. And if the killing is done right, and for the right reasons, the killing, too, is right. By my 12th year, the chemical testosterone had already started its fiendish work. It first attacks the unsuspecting childish brain, the boyish body still unaware of the devilment the chemical will render. In its early stages, the cynics call the disease puppy love. If it is puppy love, I say it is as deep and painful and splendid as the full-blown kind. It is puppish only because it is innocent. In my freshman year at Sheridan High, I fell in love with Virginia. We went to dances at the canteen, where we played the jukebox and jitterbugged and danced close to songs like Miss the Saturday Dance and Deep Purple. Always, and it had to be you. During the summer of 1943, my father took a job in Laramie with a sponge iron plant as part of a government experiment to determine if iron, so necessary for the war effort, could be economically extracted from the low-grade iron ores in that area. As a result of his new job, we moved back to Laramie. I would be a sophomore. That summer, the war was raging, and most of the qualified men had been drafted. I advertised for summer work in the Laramie Boomerang and got a job right off at a ranch near Medicine Bow. So on the first day of summer vacation, my father loaded me into the family's '37 Ford, along with a bedroll and a single change of clothes, and hauled me off across 80 miles of sagebrush and dirt roads and desolate horizons to the Lemke-Hermberg Ranch. The ranch was a large sheep operation covering thousands of acres which spread across miles of distant forsaken prairies. At 13, I found myself alone, all alone in the back country of Wyoming in charge of 1,000 bestial, empty-bellied, bleating, wild-eyed sheep. I slept in the traditional sheepherder's wagon, a horse-drawn affair with a round canvas roof held up by staves like the covered wagons of old. The wagon was furnished with a wood-burning stove and a fold-down kitchen table. Behind the table lay a bunk with a worn cotton mattress and a gasoline lantern hung overhead from a hook affixed to the roof. I bounded from bed in the early morning in my long underwear, the temperature near freezing, bent on my duty to hold the herd together. And no sooner had I herded 1,000 in one direction than they were off in a cloud of dust running still in every other direction. By the time I saw old man Hermberg's pickup rattling up the road to return me to civilization a few weeks later, I was worn down to a bundle of rags and rattling bones.